£2 million in legal costs to fight the Rwanda case through the courts. That adds up to the hundreds of millions of pounds that have already been spent before anybody actually goes there. So it is a very expensive policy. And given that it's designed to try and prevent spending £8 million a day on hotels, and the cost of things like the Bibby Stockholm are rising too, the government is absolutely just sending money flying out the door on this policy, and as yet really not seeing a huge amount of return for it.
Well, Kate McCann's here, our political editor. It is always a double-edged sword, by the way, when politicians start quoting unattributable quotes about someone else to anyone, because there's always one about them somewhere else. However, after what we saw yesterday, it was a bit of a gift to Keir Starmer, and he gleefully unwrapped it at question time, didn't he?
He did, absolutely. He started off really strong, actually, in PMQs today. I was in the press gallery, and I have to admit, most people in the chamber were having a laugh at that particular gag, and there was one that followed it too. And even some Tory MPs were looking a little bit like they were trying to stifle a giggle. I think the Prime Minister didn't quite know what to say. He came back with something along the lines of, well, you should hear what they say about you, but that would be expected given that they are in the opposition. So not necessarily the best zinger, but I mean, it kind of tailed off towards the end. And I think that tells you, the mood in Parliament right now is that people are just kind of fed up and waiting to get to Christmas. I mean, Labour were fairly buoyed by what happened yesterday because, I mean, they see the Conservative Party doing itself in as a win for them. But as you just mentioned there, the favourability ratings, it is worth just reflecting on the fact that while Rishi Sunak is more disliked and not as liked, Sir Keir Starmer's not exactly loved. He's only on 32% of people saying they like him compared to 21% who say they like the Prime Minister. So he's not exactly romping away in terms of people's opinion at the moment.
No, I mean, still a pretty remarkable opinion poll. I mean, there's the personal satisfaction ratings you mentioned there, but also how many people believe that the Rwanda plan can work? It is a majestic 1%.
Yeah.
And when you read that, it hits you between the eyes, 1%. But you also have to wonder, how many people in government really believe it can work?
I think in government, they still think there is a glimmer of hope. And I actually think the reason for that is something that James Cleverly has taken to saying, the Home Secretary, more often than not now, which is that the UK has been at the vanguard of this policy, if you like, that other countries around the world are now looking at, talking about and investigating whether or not they could issue or run similar schemes. So I think the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister are suggesting that the UK is at the cutting edge, and therefore they will have to go through some of these, disappointments, if you like, if that's how you want to put it, but eventually the scheme will be up and running. The question is when, though. And I think that's the issue. We're starting to hear more about the costs, £2 million in legal costs to fight the Rwanda case through the courts. That adds up to the hundreds of millions of pounds that have already been spent before anybody actually goes there. So it is a very expensive policy. And given that it's designed to try and prevent spending £8 million a day on hotels, and the cost of things like the Bibby Stockholm are rising too, the government is absolutely just sending money flying out the door on this policy, and as yet really not seeing a huge amount of return for it.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about that. I mean, the migrant, let's call it the migrant crisis around the world, it is causing people to redefine attitudes, basic attitudes about politics in all parts of the world, in democracies here, there, and everywhere. But as for our own Prime Minister, he's on a kind of tightrope, isn't he? I mean, he can't change course on his Rwanda plan, or he's going to fall off to the right and left and be consumed by various beasts of the left and right in his own party. And the rope, as it is leading, it seems, to a dead end in the House of Lords.
Yeah, although I think even before he gets to the House of Lords, of course, he's got to get it through the next stage in the Commons, and that will be problematic. I mean, we spent all day yesterday talking about the fact that the right wing of the party were essentially holding the Prime Minister to ransom on it. They are now expecting him to make some fairly significant changes. And I think, Michael Tomlinson, the illegal immigration minister, had promised meetings between lawyers. Now, Downing Street was asked about that today and seemed to indicate that they weren't aware of any current plans to do that, although they would be listening, they said, to the representations of MPs. And that will not be good enough. At the end of the day, MPs will want to know that their lawyers will be able to have an active role in rewriting this bill and tabling new amendments. And as we've heard, the two of us have been speaking to people across the last couple of days from the centre of the party who say, well, hang on a minute, this is as far as we can go. We won't take any more amendments to this. So, that's before we even get into talking about whether or not the One Nation centrists could be looking to amend the bill themselves. Yeah. And that's before we get to the House of Lords. So you can see it's a pretty thorny path. And The timetable for this will be interesting because the Prime Minister has called this emergency legislation. Now, Parliament's only sitting, I think, for 2 days next week, and it's not full of business. A lot of MPs will leave this week and probably not come back. They do have the time to take these negotiations up to the wire to try and really push this through, if not this session, in January. And yet there's a talk now that the bill may not come back until the second, maybe the third week of January instead of the first. So you can see them sort of putting off what has been called emergency legislation and is now being treated very much not like that.
Yeah, it's going to end up, one imagines, in a game of who blinks first, another game of political chicken, even before our turkey has digested.